my name is Roisin and welcome back to my channel. So in today's video I'm going to talk to you about the 10 books that I read in 2022 that I liked the least. The 10 worst books I read in 2022. You of course may disagree with me about these books. It is all about personal taste. So these are the books that I liked the least, but that doesn't mean they are bad books. I just didn't like them. And so I'm going to talk to you about them now. However, when I was making this list, when I was looking over the list of books that I've given the lowest ratings on Storygraph, or books that I just remember disliking, I realised that a lot of these books are so forgettable, and that's part of the reason I didn't like them. My memory of the books that I've read this year is not great for some reason. Usually I'm pretty good at that, but this year I seem to have really forgotten a lot of the books that I read. Some books I was like, I didn't even remember that I'd read that book. Like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, completely forgot that I read that book this year. So I decided to go and watch the videos where I reviewed these, and I thought whilst doing that, rather than me sitting here trying to rack my brains remembering what I disliked about a book or why I disliked a book, it might be more interesting for you to listen to me from that time period talk about those books. We're going to think of this as like an end of the year clip show, and I'm going to introduce the books that were my least favourite books and then send you back to Roisin just after she read them, when she can actually remember them, to tell you what I disliked about them. I'm going to do this in chronological order, and so back in January I read Waterstone's best-selling historical fiction of 2021. And during that I read Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. This is a retelling of the Greek myth of Ariadne, who is the daughter of King Midas, who built the labyrinth where the Minotaur lives. She's the one who gives a red string to Theseus to help him to kill the Minotaur and get out of the labyrinth, and then he ends up abandoning her on a beach and she marries Dionysus. And that's kind of the story that's being retold in Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. So let's go back to me in January to see what I thought of it at the time. A book with a lot of plot. A lot happened leading up to the first half, and then all of a sudden everything just sort of stands still, and then again speeds up really rapidly towards the end when we get to Dionysus's war. I have yet to find a Greek myth adaptation that I've really loved. Despite having a classics degree, despite being interested in this sort of thing, I have yet to find one that really has spoken to me. They all go in a very predictable route. I felt like the writing was very, again, clunky and overly attempting to be flowery in a way that fell flat. Repetitive similes, and a lot of the time what happened in this book was the myth was done through storytelling, which I thought was an interesting idea because ancient Greece was an oral, pre-classical Athens, like a place where stories were told, and so using that method to tell the stories was kind of fitting in the fact that a lot of these myths began as oral tradition. I felt like it just ended up feeling like info dumping and a lot of exposition. I think it could have been cleverer had it shifted focus and it felt like we'd gone into that part of the story, but it didn't. It always constantly felt like someone was telling us a story, and I think that dragged the pacing to allow us to develop the characters. Like, I think had, again, that storytelling, the way the stories have been told, been a way to reflect upon what those characters were like, but they weren't. Everything was very surface level and upfront, and I don't really like that. Also in January I read books from Central Africa, and one of those books was Alabastada by Trifonia Melibea Obono. This was a book from Equatorial Guinea that was exploring LGBTQ community in Equatorial Guinea, about a girl whose uncle has been shunned for being gay and who is exploring her own sexual and gender expression. Again, let's go back to me of January to see what I made of that. And this was the first book by a woman from Equatorial Guinea to have been translated into English, and unfortunately I really didn't like this book. A book where a lot of things happen one after the other. There's a lot of rapidity in the plot. It's never really allowed for any time to sink in for the last thing, and the writing itself, I don't know if it's just the translation, was so stripped and so basic and so awkward and clunky, and I don't think it can just be the translation, because it's a very short novella, and I think that the lack of development of the characters and the overly rapid pacing would have bothered me even if I read it in the original language. I think the plainness and the lumpenness of the prose could be down to the translator. It's a very short book, but I don't think it was really worth reading. It is one of the only queer books from any of these regions really that I've read. There was an essay at the back about queerness in Africa, which I thought was fairly interesting, but overall I just didn't really get very much from that book. Last year I was trying to read 30 classics before I turned 30. I did not manage it, but one of the classics that I did read was Out of Africa by Isaac Dinesen. This was a book that was recommended to me ages ago, and I had the ebook on my Kindle, and so I read it when I was reading classics, and I think this was in February. But I really didn't like this one at all, despite it having some beautiful writing, which is why it had been recommended to me. So let's go to me of February to see what it was about it that I specifically hated. I also read Out of Africa by Isaac Dinesen, or Karen Blixen as is her real name, who is a Danish writer who was writing, this is her memoir of having lived on owned a coffee plantation in British East Africa, as it was at the time, but as we would now call it, Kenya, in the 1900s to the 1930s. This is a book that I was recommended because of the beauty of the nature writing, and it is really beautifully written. I was recommended it about 15 years ago, and I think that the writing is really lovely, wonderfully evocative writing about like the weather and about the landscape, and also about some of the things like the indigenous Kenyan dances and things. I thought that the writing of that was really lovely, but that's about all that can be said positive for this book. It gets very repetitive, and that beautiful writing doesn't save it, and it is also probably the most colonialist and racist book that I've read. I don't know if ever, but definitely in a very long time, which you kind of have to expect about this Danish noblewoman living in Kenya in the early 1900s. It was a hard slog to read, and constant reference to people being savages, constant really horrible stereotypes about the Kikuyu people and the Somali people, the Arab people and the Indian people, just horrible stereotypes constantly repeated, and particularly with the black people, constant references and comparisons between them and animals, horribly racist. And so whilst I think if you go into it with that knowledge, there is still some interest to be got from it. For example, the talk about the conscription of Kenyan and Somali people during the Second World War, or the First World War, and how they didn't want to conscript the Maasai because then they might organise, and that would be bad for the British Empire. I was also reading books from Northern Europe back at the start of this year, and like I said, I read Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, but the one that I read that I really disliked and now have absolutely zero recollection of what it is about is Thirst by Amélie Nothomb, who is a Belgian writer, and this was translated from the French, so we can go back to me at the beginning of this year to see what particularly it was that I hated. This is about Jesus in his final days. See him at his trial, through his torture, and then on the cross, and his resurrection. So it does cover a great deal of ground, and I think that that is very fertile ground for something. But this, I've talked before about how for me, when I read books, I like setting, and I think setting is important for me. I want books to feel tangible. I'm not really here for books that are entirely within one's brain. I want books to have a sense of place. And this book had absolutely no sense of place, or even of Jesus as a man. It was using this time period to talk about several philosophical ideas that Nothomb wanted to explore, and I thought that that could have been done by anyone at any point in history. It didn't feel very relevant to Jesus. I did think that it was interesting the way that it kind of made Jesus this kind of fallible, judgy, grumpy bloke who was just upset, and I think that exploring the humanity of Jesus is an interesting idea of something to do in fiction, but I think that mostly they're more like a philosophical exploration, and I don't really like to read philosophy. It's not really my jam. I found this book to be repetitive, and it's, you know, tiny short and still repetitive. It felt so loosely connected to its story. I also felt like the writing style had that kind of academic philosophy style of writing with random colloquialisms felt joined through, and the back talks about it being darkly comic, but I really couldn't get that from this. It felt much just more jarring and awkward and kind of pretentious. The next one is one that I read in March during the Irish Readathon, and I do remember this one. I'm still going to send you back to me of March because I think I was more eloquent about what I hated about it then, but I I have such visceral memories of hating this book, and that is A Ghost in the Throat by Doreen Nagripa. This was one that I picked up because it was a Foyles Book of the Year, and one that I was really excited to read. It's written by a poet. Doreen Nagripa is a poet, and she is writing about her own experience of motherhood and poetry, and also her obsession with a 17th century poet by an Irish woman, which I, had a blend of historical fiction and of poetry, and so I was really excited because those are all things I'm interested in, but I really didn't like it, and this is why. It is written by a poet, and so there is some really lovely writing, and it's really engaging in that way, but it felt dreadfully repetitive and kind of melancholy in a way that I don't get on with, like mopey, and I get very grumpy at people who feel when there's so much self-pity. I can't really get on board with self-pity. And on top of that, what really annoyed me more than anything else was the equation of womanhood and motherhood in this book. Because it wasn't just like, oh, I feel like motherhood's super important to me, as in Doreen Nagripa. She was like, when you are a woman, motherhood is the pinnacle of your experience, basically. And I was just like, I couldn't get on with it. This sort of motherhood as abnegation and the joys of self-sacrifice, all of these old stories about that women have had to put up with for centuries being put forward as like liberating and powerful. And I just found it so alienating. Like, I'm not a mother, and so maybe my experience, my thoughts would change had I been a mother, when I felt very gender essentialist and your womanhood is in your womb and that sort of thing. And it drove me up the wall, to be perfectly honest. Like, lovely writing, and I wish she just stuck to it being about herself, but all of this sort of generalizations and talking about womanhood in that way, I couldn't stand it. The next 4 books are all books that were on prize shortlists this year. I read a lot of prize shortlists in 2022. I have a whole playlist of them, which I will leave in the cards above, and it really wasn't particularly successful a lot of the time. One of the ones I read whilst doing that was What Storm, What Thunder by Miriam J.A. Chansey. This is another one of those books. In fact, most of the books that I read for that shortlist have really fallen out of my head. They've not been memorable books at all, but in particular, What Storm, What Thunder was the one that when I rewatched, I realised annoyed me the most. So I will let you see what I thought of that. About the Haitian earthquake in 2010, and it is kind of an ensemble novel told from different perspectives, but they are all interlinked, about the days leading up to the 2010 earthquake, and then during the earthquake, and also the aftermath of that, from characters spread throughout Haiti and also in New York and in Rwanda, across the world, and their reactions to what happened back home. This is a style of novel that I do enjoy, and I like that kind of choral voice thing that can happen from that, but I just found the writing in this really weak. It was, again, very earnest. Felt like it was like slam poetry but written in prose, in a way that I really don't get on board with. Like, there was some beautiful lyrical moments, but there were also some overwrought and very earnest moments, which I think is something that I'm saying a lot about all of these books. They didn't have subtlety, they weren't pared down, they were very like in your face, which apparently is not something I like in books. I don't want them to be like that. And I do also think it's partly the fault of me reading all 5 of these books at once. I was sick of being preached to, and so being preached to again drove me up the wall. And yeah, I just didn't feel like the characters were that well fleshed out in this book. I thought that as representations of parts of society in Haiti and the way things have worked in Haiti, some of it was alright. Really got on my nerves, and I started off listening to the audiobook of this, but the audiobook performance really turned that feeling up. Like, it really leaned into that aspect of the book and made me so annoyed. It just felt very cheesy and inauthentic, and I just had to give up on it. It might have been the same shortlist when I read The Sweetness of Water by Nathan Harris, but I'm not entirely sure. This was another piece of historical fiction, which of course you probably know I tend to enjoy historical fiction. It is a genre that really speaks to me, but I really didn't enjoy this one, and there were several reasons why. It is one of the ones that I do remember more of, but I don't really remember what the plot was, so I will let me from the past tell you about that. And one of those was The Sweetness of Water by Nathan Harris, and this is about the end of the American Civil War and these 2 freed brothers who end up on a farm nearby the place where they were enslaved, working for this man who does pay them and pays them well, who has lost his son during the Civil War, and is trying to grow peanuts on his land. He's never done anything with his land before, and he hires these two brothers. But it's not long before there's still the tension of the end of slavery and the emancipation. This book was very strangely paced. The first part of it's quite slow, about these people, the two brothers and this husband and wife, getting to know one another and kind of finding their place, and then it's all of a sudden hugely rushed when everything comes to a head in the middle, and then again we slow down at the end that I felt was entirely unnecessary. Like, there was so many points in this book, in the last quarter of this book, where I was like, why is there still more book? This feels like an ending that feels satisfactory, but we're just keeping going, and I found that kind of unnecessary. White characters, George and his wife, are like completely not racist and have no views that you would think people of their time period would have, and it just feels a little unrealistic to have these kind of white saviour characters who are perfectly moral. They don't feel very of their time, and they don't have to overcome anything to get to that point of view, and the writing itself, it didn't feel particularly well developed for me. It felt kind of quite flat, and I didn't think it had much. So like, the characters didn't change, there was no development of them throughout, and the writing itself didn't hold any beauty in the description. There was also two Confederate soldiers who are in love, or who are in a relationship with each other. That's quite strange, but believable and understandable. But yeah, I just felt like this wasn't the best version of this. It felt underdeveloped, and I think I could really tell that it was a debut. The Women's Prize shortlist this year also was quite disappointing to me. I didn't really love, I think I loved The Sentence, but most of the books on there I didn't love at all. But the one that wound me up the most was The Island of Missing Trees by Elif Shafak. Honestly, it drove me absolutely crazy, and you will see why from my review back in the summer. This was my least favourite out of all the books that were on the shortlist. Well, it's set over two time periods. One period is in Cyprus in the 1970s, about two teenagers one who is Turkish Cypriot, one is Greek Cypriot, and they fall in love, and then the Civil War happens. It's about their like forbidden love relationship. Then the other part is set in the future with their daughter, and the mother has just passed away, and so it's about the daughter and the father dealing with their grief, and the daughter finding out about her family's history and more about Cyprus. And parts of it are narrated by a fig tree, which was in a bar where these two people met. Yeah, I just found that the writing was quite sanctimonious. I found it quite heavy-handed. There were a lot of extended metaphors and ridiculous similes that really drove me up the wall. Just over-explaining everything. Everything felt very on the nose. There was no space given for the reader to explore or to come to their own conclusions. Everything was very frank and upfront. I thought the dialogue was incredibly unconvincing, and everyone sounded exactly the same. There weren't really individual personalities, and overall I just thought it was poorly written and poorly executed, and kind of annoying and grating. So I really didn't enjoy this one, unfortunately. I know it's been one that's been quite popular, but for me it didn't work. I also read the Wainwright Prize for nature writing, and whilst I loved a few of the books from that, the one that I really didn't like was The Instant by Amy Liptrot. I have found that self-pitying voices are ones that I really struggle with over the course of this year, and Amy Liptrot's voice definitely was that. But I have other reasons I disliked it, and I will let me from the past tell you about them. This is about a woman who goes to Berlin to escape her own loneliness living in the Outer Hebrides, and her relationships with herself and with the city and with the wildlife of the city, and her longing for home and longing for stability. Wanted more nature writing, kind of self-indulgent, not special. I'm enjoying the talk of bird watching and the birds in Berlin, urban bird watching. I think that that's quite interesting. Mixture of a linear and a more vignette style, that kind of detached millennial writing. Feels like it applies to this, but I'm not enjoying the talk about the internet and the internet making us be separate from ourselves and like staring at screens and all that. It feels like it's kind of overdone and tired. Like, they're not really talking about anything true, they're just talking about the internet the way people talk about the internet. And then finally, the 10th book that made it onto my list this year is one that I read because I wanted something fun and comforting and just easy to read, one that I thought would be simple, probably not my favourite, but I would enjoy it, and that is Book Lovers by Emily Henry. And I found this book so very, very grating and annoying, and I'm sure you can see that coming off the screen when you watch my review of it. I have seen a lot of Emily Henry around, people talk about her all the time, and I thought it would just be a nice light rom-com book for me to read as a little brain break, and I thought I would enjoy it because everybody talks about it and talks about how good it is, and I really didn't like it. And I was so surprised. I thought it would be at the very worst inoffensive and a 3-star book that's just like middle of the road. Yeah, it's fine, I enjoyed it, but I didn't really feel drawn to it. But no, I thought that this was actively bad. And so I was surprised by how much raving it has got. It is about two people, one of whom I can't remember either of their names anymore. One of whom is this, like, your stereotypical uptight career woman with trauma in her past, that makes her this way and unable to let go of everything, and everyone thinks she's like cold and mean. And it starts off with like, this is the trope and I'm going to deconstruct this trope. It doesn't deconstruct the trope, it does the trope. This guy who is very rude and abrupt to her, and they both work in publishing, that's why they're book people. And her sister, who is heavily pregnant, drags her off to this small town to get away from her life and to have a little adventure. And she is a literary agent, and she's also working with one of her main clients who has written a book set in this small town that has become a bestseller. And so these two people obviously are grumpy and upset with each other all the time, but they end up having to work together because he turns up in the small town too, and romance ensues. You know who the romance is from the beginning, and that is not a problem that I have with romance. What I found about this was that it was very repetitive. I found that there were only 2 characters in it. All the other characters were flat and one-dimensional and didn't have any like personality. Neither of our characters had any friends. One had a sister, one had parents, and that was it. I found that the backstory, the tragic backstory, was being constantly referred to in very obvious ways, and everything was very like hit you over the head with it. I found that the romance didn't. She wrote attraction well. I could see them being attracted to one another, but that kind of build up of romance, it felt like they both had trauma and that was just used as an excuse to smash them together, rather than any building of actual relationships between these two people. I couldn't see, beyond the fact that they clearly wanted to rip each other's clothes off, what they actually, any actual like spark or connection between them. And the writing was just so cheesy. It was the cheesiest, most repetitive, most overwrought similes and real intense people talking about their feelings. You aren't like that, you are like this and this, and the things that they see in each other over and over again in a very repetitive way, with all these metaphors that just felt laboured, and it felt like it was working so hard to be not very good. There you have it. Those are the 10 worst books that I read this year. I won't be doing a clip video for my 10 best books, which will be coming out shortly. I'm definitely going to talk to you about them, because the fact they're on my best books list means that I definitely do remember them. But let me know in the comments down below what you thought of this. It's definitely a little more work for me having to edit in all of those videos from the past, but I think it might be more interesting. I might have more clarity in what I'm saying about the books. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Did it work for you doing it this way? And thank you for watching. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and to subscribe. I put out new videos twice a week, so I will see you again very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.